Welcome to A Dram of Outlander. This is Desiree, your podcaster and the writer for ADramofOutlander.com for all things Outlander, from the Diana Gabaldon book series to the Stars TV series and everything in between. This is episode 87, The Scottish Prisoner, week 19. Hello again. Well, we are definitely in it for this book. We have reached the denouement, and we're coming down the other side. There are only 3 more episodes, including this one, until we finish this book. And I would love your feedback. I will be deciding what to do next as we wait for Droughtlander to end. And if you have suggestions for what novellas or other types of podcasts you would like in the interim before the show comes back, please email me at contact@adramofoutlander.com, or you call me at 719-425-9444 and leave me a voicemail message. And I will greatly appreciate your insights. Okay, so we left off chapter 36 with Jamie finding Tobias Quinn having committed suicide, and his blood was overflowing the Druid King's cup. That was devastating for Jamie. And that was another unintended consequence, perhaps, of his stopping the Jacobite uprising by giving Hal and John the information. There's a lot of that in this book. Wow. There's so much grief that they have to deal with at this point. Chapter 37, Sole Witness, Inishclara. So Jamie knows, of course, that Quinn cannot be buried in consecrated ground because he committed suicide and he's Catholic. That is a sin that cannot be overcome. So he takes Quinn's body back to Ireland, and he's back at Inishclara where Abbot Michael is. And the abbot offered him help, but Jamie declines the offer except for taking a shovel because he knows that he's the only one who is truly the one who witnessed Quinn's death. He dragged the coffin behind him with the rope around his body as he went through all that boggy, peaty land. And he settled upon the little hill in the middle of the bog, and he begins to dig. He sees himself as the sole witness, the sole mourner. He had told the brothers Grey that he was going to Ireland by himself to bury Quinn. They simply agreed. They didn't put any conditions on it. They knew, of course, Jamie would return. He's a man of his word. He knew that though others had seen the body, he was the only true witness, because few understood this death the way that he could. He knows what it's like to lose meaning in your life. And he thinks the loss of that chance, that uprising, that purpose is what killed Quinn. He would rather die for it than live without it. And Jamie knows if he had not had the earthly ties of flesh and blood, he could have come to this very end. He could still, if not for those ties, because now he not only has his family, an extended family from Lallybroch, he has William. And Claire still ties him here, even though she's back into the future. Like Claire, Jamie is part of the earth. They both are. And the description of the soil, of being rocky and hard-packed for the first inches, and though it became rich and soft from lake silt and decayed peat moss, has the ground opening easily for the grave. and it deepens with the rhythm of his shoveling. Considering the fact that Jamie has no music anymore, he still has a rhythm, and part of him is part of the earth. And I love that the earth is receiving Quinn, is opening to take Quinn back, ashes to ashes. I know there's more meaning in this, but I haven't quite unpacked it yet, so please send me your thoughts. This also reminds me of how Jamie is. Jamie's a bit rocky and hard-packed on the surface, but on the inside, he is soft and receiving, and he's got a richness to him. And if you can get past those barriers and those layers, you're in. He's yours and you're his. And I think he looked at Quinn as more than just a comrade in arms, so to speak. He felt that he was a friend. There was more to their relationship, and this is his burden to carry out. Quinn had reached past those barriers of Jamie. And as he shovels, he's thinking of that word, tained. Was it for him, or was it for Quinn, that tithe to hell? It must have been meant for Quinn himself, because he expected to go to hell as a suicide. But why leave that word written in his own blood? Confession, accusation? If he had known what Jamie had done, he may have written the word traitor in Irish Gaelic. But tained carried a bit more weight. I don't know. I suppose it was for Quinn, but maybe it was also a double message for Jamie. The day was warm, and Jamie stripped his breeks off down to his shirt, and then later on, he took his shirt off and he worked naked to the air, wearing nothing but sandals and a handkerchief bound around his head to keep the sweat from rolling into his eyes. Okay, let's stop for a moment. All of you Jamie lovers. He's standing in the middle of a peat bog on a little hill. It's a sunny day. He's working buck naked, shoveling. Yeah, how many of you would just buy popcorn and watch that going on? That would be a sight to stumble upon, wouldn't it? I think it's really interesting that under the rules of modesty, that it doesn't apply for, say, labor or field work. There's many times where we would see Jamie take his pants off and just work in his shirt or work naked. I think it's a fascinating code, so to speak. So it took Jamie quite a long time, and it was late when he'd gotten the grave to his satisfaction. He could see water seeping into the bottom of the hole, but he knew it was deep enough that no fox or other animals could get down and scrabble at the coffin lid. Then he started wondering if Quinn would be preserved like the thrice killed man from the bog, or if the box and body would rot altogether at once. He looked up at the slope at the other unmarked grave, and he's glad that Quinn would not lie alone. He brought that cup, the Druid King's cup. It lay wrapped in his cloak, awaiting restoration, but he doesn't know to who. And he reflects that John nor the abbot had asked about it at all. And he knew that this thing was given into his hands to do with as he wished, but he only wanted to get rid of it. That cup spooked him like crazy. And he says, Lord, let this cup pass away. He said this as he dragged the coffin to the lip of the grave. He had to shove it hard, and it fell into the hole with a crunk. It made him tremble, and he gasped. He had to wipe his face with the back of his hand. He checked to make sure the lid didn't come off, or the coffin hadn't burst open or turned sideways, and he began to fill the grave once more with the dirt. Now we see what's going on around him. The sun was dropping toward the horizon, and he had to work fast or he would risk being stranded on the islet for the night. I think that would be super creepy. And, no lights, just him, some dead people, and the supernatural lands. And even though the air had cooled, the midges had come out. And so he had to put his shirt back on. Oh, no more naked Jamie. The light came in, low and flat. It was gilding the clouds, and the bog glimmered like gold and jet. So he's really looking at the space around him. He takes up the shovel again, but he hears a noise and it makes him turn around. He couldn't tell quite what it was, but it wasn't a bird or the Abbey's bell. It was something he had never heard before, but was also totally familiar. And he notices that the bog had fallen completely silent. Even the midges had ceased. He listened, but he didn't hear it again, and he began to shovel, every once in a while pausing to see if he could hear that sound again. And as he was nearly finished, it came again. The grave was neatly mounded, though with an opening at the head. That's where he planned on putting the cup. Let Quinn take the bloody thing to hell with him, he thought. As he lifted his cloak to unwrap the cup, twilight began to rise from the earth, and the sound came clear to him through the air that was still. It was a horn. No, it was horns, like trumpets. But trumpets he'd never heard of, and it made the hairs ripple all over his body. He was getting the willies again. And all he could think was, they're coming. He just got dressed really quickly, and he didn't run because he didn't think they were coming for him. So it was okay for him to stay, or at least not run. He could see them. There were figures coming out of the distance, taking shape, as though they materialized from thin air. Well, that's probably exactly what they did do, he thinks. There was no mist and no fog over the water, but the party kept coming toward him, men and women. They'd come from nowhere, and nothing lay behind them except a stretch of bog that reached clear to the shore of the lake beyond. The horn sounded again. It was discordant and flat, but with his head injury, he wasn't sure if he would hear it differently. He saw the horns themselves. They were curving tubes that caught the rays of the sinking sun, and they shone like gold. And then he realizes it sounds like something particular, like the honking of wild geese. One of the previous podcast posts, I had used the picture of the wild hunt a couple of times. It was a painting. I will post it in this as well today because it was really eerie and it showed what I think Jamie probably saw in this book. And they were getting closer. He could make out faces and details. They wore plain clothing. It looked like homespun, except there was one woman dressed in white. And he wonders why her skirt is not spattered with mud. And then, to his horror, he notices her feet did not touch the ground. None of their feet touched the ground. And he sees someone who carried a knife with a long curved blade and a glinting hilt. Now there keeps being mention of shiny, glinting, how the sun is playing off of objects and off of the bog. What does that mean? I'll need to do some research. But Jamie thinks he must remember to tell Father Michael that it was not a sword, that killed the thrice killed man. Now he notices something else in the plain appearance of the crowd. There were about 30 people, he thinks. Following the woman came a tall man, and he had a checkered weave cloak. He wore a rope around his neck, and Jamie could almost feel that around his own neck when he looked at him. And then he thinks about the names that Father Michael had told him. Asus, Tyrannus, Two-Tits, Two-Tates, not Two-Tits. One of the men turned toward him, then the other, and finally the woman looked at him. This caused Jamie to cross himself, invoking the Trinity loudly, and the older gods turned their gaze away. He also saw one carrying a maul. He had used to wonder how Lot's wife could turn into a pillar of salt, but now he completely understood it, because he was frozen. And the horns blew a third time, and the crowd came to a stop. They were inches above the glimmering surface of the bog. They formed a circle around the tall man. He stood a head taller than anyone else, and the sun lit his hair with a gleam of fire. So again, we have glimmering, shone, gleam. I definitely need to do some research and figure out what that means to this story. The woman in white came near. She was lifting her blade. The man with the maul moved ceremoniously behind the tall man, and a third reached for the end of the rope around his neck. And Jamie shouts, "No!" And he draws back his arm, and he hurls the cup as hard as he can into the midst of the eerie crowd. It hit the bog with a splash, and the people vanished. So it looked like they were going through a ceremony to kill the tall man. Do I know what that ceremony is about? No, I don't. If you know, let me know. So Jamie had to blink, and he had to squint against the glare of the setting sun. But he notices that nothing moves on the surface of the bog. It's silent. No birds were singing. And then he got sudden energy, and he seized the shovel, finished covering up the grave, tamping it down, grabbed his cloak, and ran, water splashing from his sandals, as he found the wooden causeway half submerged. He definitely does not want to get stuck on this little hill overnight. And behind him, he thought he could hear the echo of wild geese calling. And he tried not to. He really did, but he had to look back. And he saw them walking away, backs turned to him, into the face of the setting sun, and no glinting sight of curving horns. But he thought he saw the flash of checkered cloth in the crowd. It might have been the tall man's cloak, or a trick of the fading light that had made the checkered cloth glow pink. So there's no glinting now, so it's over. That's my guess. Wow. So Jamie has experienced them, or they, this type of supernatural experience before. Remember when he told the story of hunting the stag, and he heard them coming, and they'd taken their portion. I would find it fascinating and scary as all get out. And I would invoke all sorts of prayers myself. So we're moving into section 5, succession. Chapter 38, redux. So we find them on their way to Helwater. Tom was with them, but nobody was speaking very much. Remember that first trip to Helwater? Now it's early autumn, but the weather had been terrible. The roads turned into mud, and the wind lashed leaves from the trees at them, so they were either damp or soaked. They were mud plastered, and absurdly were spangled with gaudy blots of red and gold leaves. Nature's taking their way with them. They came to each inn at night, shaken with cold, blue-lipped, and wanting nothing save warmth and food. They shared a room, but never a bed. If there were not beds enough, Jamie slept on the floor with Tom, wrapped in his cloak. And John thinks he would have liked to lie in the darkness listening to them breathe. They're his people. He loves them. He loves Jamie more than just his object of sexual desire. But he normally fell asleep quickly because he was so exhausted. He almost felt like he was escorting Jamie to his execution, like he knew Jamie wouldn't really die, and he hoped he would live in contentment. But he also knows that their arrival at Helwater would be the death of the relationship that had grown up between them. They could no longer behave as equals. Considering that John struggles so much with that essence of equality, that he goes back to his biases of being an upper crusty English with a title, and that the Scots are savages, especially Highland Scots like Jamie is, that he's always checking himself. And he often stumbles with these biases. He does. And so he can see very clearly right now that they can no longer behave as equals, and it's shattering to him. That ease of relationship that has grown over months and months of time, where it appeared under the illusion of freedom that they are equals and that they could have a friendship. And he thinks that he and Jamie will speak on occasion, but not like before. It would be stiff, formal conversation of jailer and prisoner, and not very often. And John thinks, I'll miss you, as he looks at the back of Jamie's head as he was negotiating a plunging slope ahead of him. He's leaning back in the saddle, his red plait swinging as the horse picked its way, slewing and skittering through the mud. And he wondered whether Jamie would also miss their conversations. But he knows better than to dwell on that thought. Yes, John can go down his rabbit holes and get stuck in those thoughts pretty easily. He clicks his tongue and his horse begins the last descent to Helwater. It was a long and winding drive, but they came to the last turn and they saw several well-bundled figures taking the air on the lawn, all women, Lady Dunsany and Isabel, and with them a couple of maidservants, Peggy the nursemaid, with William in her arms, and Betty Mitchell. He could feel Jamie stiffen, rising slightly in his saddle at the sight, and this made John's heart contract. Sudden surge of eagerness. And all I could think was his choice. And he follows his prisoner back into captivity. I mean, that alone is such a big deal. Jamie is choosing to stay a prisoner. He could have gotten pardoned. It would have been over. The acts of service that he did with Hal and John clearly would take that blemish of him being a traitor, of committing treason, off of him. And John is taking him back against his own will. John does not want to do it, right? It's difficult for him. So you remember one of the other groomsmen, Hanks. Well, he died falling off the ladder, just to jump right back into estate life. Crusoe said he died quicker than he deserved. It was obvious to Jamie that Crusoe wasn't sure if he liked Jamie coming back or not. But he also knew that he didn't need training and Crusoe would need help. All Jamie could say was, God rest his soul. Left the question of who would be head groom. He didn't care who took it. They would deal with it later. And then he says he'll take Eugenie's string out. So he's going to take horses out to do their running, get their exercise. Jamie went up the ladder to the loft to leave his belongings. He'd come back much better clothed than when he left. They were still rough, but they were new. He had new stockings, a good belt, a slouch hat. The slouch hat came from Tom Bird. He put these items in the box that stood beside his pallet, and he checked to see if his other things were still there. They were, and his little treasure box things were a statue of the Virgin that Jenny had sent him, a dried mole's foot to be carried against rheumatism. And he decided to take that out and put it in his little pouch at his waist, because his right knee began to ache on wet mornings since Ireland. The stub of a pencil, a tinderbox, a chipped pottery candlestick with an inch of melted wax still in it, and a bunch of stones. There were 11 of them, one for each his sister, for Ian, young Ian, Maggie, Kitty, Janet, Michael, young Jamie, for his daughter Faith, who had died at birth, for the other child Claire had carried when she went through, and a piece of rough amethyst for Claire herself. And he thinks he has to find one more for William. He was happy to find his things as they were. Only a blanket had been taken, but nobody messed with the rest of his stuff. They presumed he would be coming back. But he thinks about his most intimate keepsake. Nobody could steal it, and it could never be lost. It was where the C was carved, a little crookedly, but still perfectly legible, on the mound at the base of his thumb, and the J he had left on her would be likewise still visible, he supposed. He hoped. That's one thing in the show that is so sad that they didn't find a way to do, is to have those initials carved into them, because it comes back and is referenced so many times in all the books. He had one more thing to put away. He had a heavy purse from the bottom of the bag and tucked it under the balled-up stockings. Remember, Hal gave him a good amount of money for his service, to thank him, to use as he would. Jamie felt surprised at the sense of peace that overcame him, that he felt in the stable. It wasn't a homecoming, but it was familiar. And he had open air and the sweet presence of horses. This is what he knows. He spent so many years there. He spent more years at Helwater than he had at Lollybrook since he was a child. He'd been bouncing back and forth. He was under Dougal's tutelage. He was in France. He was on the run. And then we have the uprising. And he hid in a cave for 7 years. I mean, the cave for 7 years, or Helwater for, that many years. I think I would take Helwater too. Prison. This has likely been his longest residence since childhood. He really doesn't have a home right now. This is as close as it gets. So he takes his string of horses out along the road. He didn't quite go to the fells, but beyond the outer paddocks, where a grassy track led the way up and over a series of small hills. He paused at the summit. He wanted to let the horses breathe and rest, and to look down over Helwater. It was a view that he liked, when it was clear enough to see. The big old house was couched comfortably in its grove of copper beeches, with the silver of the water beyond, rippling in the wind. It sounds pretty idyllic. He couldn't see any birds right now except for one small hawk. It was looking for mice in the dead grass, he thinks. And then he notices two tiny figures coming out along the drive. It was two men mounted, Lord Dunsany and Lord John. He recognized the first by his stooped shoulders and the way his head jutted forward, the second by his square, solid seat and his easy one-handed way with the reins. "And he thinks God be with ye, Englishmen." Jamie had to smile to himself over the lie about him announcing his desire to court Betty Mitchell, because John had tried to suppress his astonishment, to be courteous. And he'd brought Jamie back to Helwater at his request. But he did have one over on John, at least temporarily. He thinks that John would leave in a few days, and he wondered if they would speak again before that happened. And how, if it did. The odd half-friendship they had forged from necessity could not in justice be forgotten. Okay, so John is thinking we can no longer speak as equals. And Jamie is thinking the odd half-friendship they had forged from necessity could not in justice be forgotten. But neither could the resumption of their present positions as essentially master and slave. Was there any ground that would let them meet again as equals? So John thinks of it in a much more simplistic way. And Jamie is having layers of deep thought to consider with his relationship with John. Yes. A posse ad esse, he mutters to himself, which means from possibility to actuality. And he gathers up his leading rein and shouts, "Hup!" And the horses happily thunder down the hill toward home. It is much more complicated on Jamie's end than it is for John, for various reasons. But the way he thinks about it gives insight to how his brain works and to the depth of his thought processes and how philosophical he really is. And he's trying to figure out this puzzle because it is a bit of an ethical issue that he has to contend with, but it's also his life. The day was cold and windy, and the leaves were blowing from the copper beeches. John had worried a bit when Lord Dunsany had suggested a ride. The man was old and frail, much more so than the last time Gray visited. And it's described as the giddy flights of sun, wind, and leaves lent the day a sense of mild excitement. And he thought it seemed to communicate itself to Dunsany. His face had a faint glow, and his hands seemed strong on the reins. But John made sure he kept the pace moderate and one eye on his ancient friend. It makes me wonder how old Dunsany really is. But John, like Jamie, is describing the atmosphere. What is going on here? What does it feel like to be in this space right now? It makes me want to shiver. They were on the lake road, and it was muddy, but it always had been muddy. The hoof hollows were filling with water, and he'd wondered how many horses had passed by before, and it couldn't have been very long. And then he got excited thinking he may encounter Jamie, even though it's a long shot because there were other grooms on the estate. But he still couldn't help but look ahead to see if Jamie was there. That formality again comes back into play where it's us and them. It's so interesting because it's obvious he and Jamie have spent much time together. The entire time Jamie's been gone, but yet he still has to keep up this pretense, this distance because of their classes, because of the situation that they're all in. Lord Dunsany had slowed his horse down just to a walk, and John got concerned that maybe the horse had picked up a stone in his hoof, but Dunsany simply wanted to talk to John privately. I mean, I guess if you want a private conversation, now we would go for a walk or a car ride, but they took a horse ride out onto the property. And John wonders if it's about Jamie, and Dunsany says, well, no, but he wonders if he'd like to make other arrangements for him. Not for the present, John says. And Dunsany says he's a very good groom. The others don't make things easy for him, and he keeps much to himself. And the words "he keeps much to himself" strike John. They came out so casually, but it really gives an insight into Jamie's life at Helwater, and it pangs him. He kept Jamie from transportation. When he could have remained in the company of other Scots, he could have had companionship. But then he thinks, if he hadn't died of seasickness, well, oh, poor Jamie. And then he again comes back to the question of Betty Mitchell. Is this why Jamie had decided to marry her? Companionship? That's some foreshadowing right there, people. Foreshadowing to his future. John had known Betty pretty well. She had been Geneva's lady's maid, and when Geneva died, she became Isabel's lady's maid. She was quick-witted and good-looking in a common way, and seemed to be popular with the other servants. With her as a wife, Jamie would be less strange to the Helwater servants and much more part of their community. Gray didn't like the idea very much, but it seemed sensible, and a way to deal with isolation and loneliness, but he still couldn't make the puzzle work out in his head. And he's in deep thought. Well, Dunsany's been talking to him this whole time. And he stammers because he's not quite sure he heard what Dunsany said, even though he did hear it. And Dunsany was proposing to amend his will, and he wants to ask John his permission to appoint him as guardian to William. And John is stunned by this. Of course, if he wishes it, but he felt like he'd been struck behind the ear with a stocking full of sand. He got walloped upside the head with this one. And he says, but surely there are other men much better qualified for the office, a male relative. But there isn't any. That's it. They're it. And he doesn't want the boy sent off to Halifax or Virginia, where there are family members who could take care of him. John had become part of the family because he had known their son who died at Culloden, and he had been brought into the fold. He'd known them for years and years of his life. And so he feels some sort of responsibility for them. And Dunsany is getting older. He's feeling his years. He was frail and ill and may not make it past this winter. And it would be irresponsible for him to die without providing for William's guardianship. Wow. It has a sense of immediacy that John is very uncomfortable with. And the idea of the property of Ellesmere is brought up as well. And the boy should know this, and he should know what is part of his title. Dunsany asks John if he needs time to consider his request, but John agrees that he will just do it. This means if something did happen to Dunsany, he would have to visit more frequently. Lady Dunsany and Isabel would care for him well. And he's plotting out the future. Like when William gets older, he'd go to school. He could divide his holidays, coming with John to London sometimes, the two of them coming to Helwater. So he's planning this out. And it's makes sense because even though he's not Gordon, the son's replacement, he's been the adopted son of the house almost. Oh boy. And he thinks, and if a son had privileges within his family, he also has responsibilities. Very true. He tells Dunsany he's honored by his request, and he promises he will execute the office to the very best of his ability. Dunsany is relieved, and he said it had been pressing upon him to a terrible degree. It's time to finish their ride and go back for tea. He believes he shall have an appetite for the first time in months now. And they sped up to a canter past the ruffled waves of the mere. In the distance, he sees movement. It's a string of horses running down the slope of a distant hill, graceful and wild as a flurry of leaves led by a horseman. We're getting to see the dance of the leaves and the wind, all the interplay. And John is feeling that way. He's feeling a bit whirlwindish inside. He has all these emotions running amok and swirling around. And he's pretty sure that it had to be Jamie. He would know him at any distance, I think. And then he comes back to the idea of Jamie and Betty marrying, and it would make it more comfortable for Jamie. But he need not stay at Helwater. It had been his choice to return, so it must, in fact, be that Betty drew him back. Well, bloody hell, it's his life, John thinks. Yep, the puzzle is not making sense. And John's brain squirrel is trying to work on what else is going on. It says Jamie was surprised at how quickly Helwater reabsorbed him. He has been surprised several times here, which is, I don't think, usual to Jamie. Normally he can predict things and he plans. But what about his own flurry of emotions going on? He not only gave up freedom, he chose to stay a prisoner. Oof, that's a big deal. And he did it because he loves the boy more than his own comfort. I love that about Jamie. But Helwater reabsorbed him quickly. A working farm has a life of its own. It has a great slow-beating heart, and everything on the farm listens to the beat and lives to that rhythm. We're going back to a heartbeat, to a rhythm. It reminds me of John's pocket watch. We keep having these same themes come in and out of the story. And of course, Jamie knows this because the rhythm of Lollybrock was deep in his bones, and it always would be. It was sorrow and comfort. If he ever went back, that familiar heartbeat would still be there. But then he thinks, and his place shall know him no more, according to the Bible. He knew that his place would always know him if he should come again, but it might not be his, which we know it isn't. He gave up that title to young Jamie. It's been run by other people. Would he fit in? Would it be his place if he goes back? That's some more foreshadowing right there. That's some information about Jamie's future. And he stops and listens. As his ear to the ground, he could feel the beating of Helwater. And it would support him in his weakness, comfort him in loneliness. He could hear the speaking of its waters and the growing of grass, the movement of horses and the silence of its rocks. The people that were part of it, a more transient part, but not unimportant. And one of those was Betty Mitchell. And he thinks that a benefit of the daily rhythm of a farm is that people were part of it. He could get a message to Betty. Okay. So he had breakfast and hung about a bit. He wanted to speak to the Welsh kitchen maid. She was deeply religious, and she thought of him as a Roman heretic. But when he told her that he had come back with news for Betty of a kinsman, she was willing to take his message. He knew that everybody would eventually find out, but this is the best he could do. So he came back in the afternoon, an hour before tea, and he found Betty waiting in the kitchen garden. She put on a clean fichu and a silver brooch. because she's thinking that Jamie's going to court her. She has her eye on him. And he recognizes, as she looks at him, that she's not sure of the power she has, but she knows she has some, and he must be careful. Because he has a plan to usurp her plan. Mrs. Betty, he says, I came to tell you about Toby. Toby Quinn? What's happened to him? He's died, lass. I'm sorry for it. She wants to know how. In the service of his king, he's buried safe in Ireland. She was shocked. She wants to know who killed him. He thinks I did, but he told her he died by his own hand, and Jamie is sorry for it. She let go of his hand and turned, walking blindly for a few steps. And she put out a hand and held tight to one of the pear trees that stood against the garden wall. The pear tree was spindly and vulnerable without its leaves. Betty is vulnerable in this moment. It took her a few minutes, and she asks if Jamie was with him, and Jamie says he would have stopped him if he was there. No, she wanted to know if Jamie had been with him while he was gone. Yes. Did the soldiers catch him? No. Why would he kill himself then, she wants to know. And all he tells her is despair. And she says, he was a papist. Despair's a sin to a papist, isn't it? Folk do a great many things they think are sins. And she can't figure out how he could have killed himself. What would make him despair? And he wants God to guide his tongue. And he says, you ken he was a Jacobite, aye. Well, there's a plot he was involved in, a great matter, with great consequences. Did it either fail or succeed? It failed, and the heart went out of the man. Her shoulders sank. Men are fools. He agrees with her. He hopes she doesn't ask any more questions. And he knew he had to leave before the conversation became personal. But she had taken his hand again, holding it between hers, and she wanted to say something that he didn't want her to say, or was about to pull loose when he heard footsteps. And it was Roberts who came. And Jamie thinks he could have kissed the man because he interrupted. And Jamie says he brought sad news to her, the death of a kinsman. Roberts was suspicious because he has his eye on Betty. But Betty looked shocked and desolate. He took her by the arm and asked if she's all right. But then she burst into tears over poor Toby. She wasn't stupid. She knew she had to put on a bit of a show to cover up what she was going to say to Jamie. And so Jamie, being the third wise party present, silently praised God and backed away, murmuring inconsequent regrets. Even though it was cold outside, Jamie was sweating. He went back to the stables. He nodded to the Welsh kitchen maid who was holding vegetables and holding a vegetable basin and waiting patiently for the godless behavior inside the walls to cease. Oh, pious kitchen maid. And she says, a death, was it? Yeah, he wasn't there to wickedly canoodle after all. He tells her a sad death. And would you say a prayer for the soul of Tobias Quinn? For a papist, for a poor sinner. I suppose so. And as we close this chapter, Jamie's thinking that the church did call despair a sin and suicide an unforgivable sin, and this because the sinner could not repent. The suicide was therefore condemned to hell and prayers thus useless. But neither Karen nor Betty was a papist, and perhaps their Protestant prayers might be heard. For himself, he prayed each night for Quinn. After all, he reasoned, it couldn't hurt. Yes, that is a keen difference between Protestants and Catholics, is Catholics will pray posthumously for someone's soul to enter heaven from purgatory. I believe I have that right. And Protestants believe you die, you either go to heaven or you don't. There's no waiting room, essentially, when the decision is being made. So we get to see Jamie's in depth of belief and faith again. He carries it with him. It's part of everything he does. And what do you suppose he's going to do with that big bag of money that he has? Because we know he really doesn't want to court Betty, but he knows he could fall into that trap because she's a kind, likable, smart woman. And he could get lulled into that sense out of loneliness and out of not fitting in. And he likes her. And John now is going to be put as guardian over William in the case of Lord Dunsany dying. There is no other male in the family, in the whole area, in the country, to do so. This will afford John some extra trips to Helwater, perhaps. We'll have to see where that goes in the future. And if you've read Voyager, you know exactly where it goes. So the heartbeat of the farm, the rhythm has taken Jamie back in. He's been lulled into that sense of the everyday, the need, which is much on a working farm. Fascinating. Home, but not home. Familiar, but still foreign. That's Jamie. And I think one of the reasons he and Claire understood each other so well is she was also home, but not home. Part of everything going on and a foreigner. She was always a Sassenach. So, yes, if you have any further explanation on the whole glinting, glimmering, shining, how the sun and light interacted with these chapters, I would like to know if you have anything further to input on that. Otherwise, for those of you who are on Twitter, I will see you on Wednesday night at 6 p.m. Pacific time, 9 p.m. Eastern time for our hashtag ADoO chat. Please, as I asked in the beginning of the episode, send me your recommendations for what you would like to do or what you would like to hear in the podcast for the next couple of months before the show comes back. We are winding down, people. We're getting closer, but we still have time to fill before the show comes back. Please send your questions or comments to contact@adramaofoutlander.com. You can also call into the voicemail line at 719-425-9444 to get your comments included in the show and your voice heard. If you would like the opportunity to come and spend 15 minutes on the podcast doing a wrap up with me, call or send an email. And where can you find A Dram of Outlander? Well, of course, the website, adramaofoutlander.com, Facebook, A Dram of Outlander page, and A Dram of Outlander group that is private, so you have to ask to join. Twitter and Instagram is Dram of Outlander without the A in front. And how do you support the podcast? Please leave reviews on iTunes and Stitcher and Google Play. If you listen through one of the streaming services, leaving reviews helps more people find the podcast. Please share the posts when I upload them. Tell people about it. Interact with other followers and listeners on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Become part of the community. We are growing friendships here, and it's wonderful and amazing. I can't imagine not having my Outlander story friends, and I can't imagine not having the friends I've made in real life because of the Outlander books. It's astonishing to me what this has turned into. You can also support the podcast by a financial offering. You can do a one-time offering. You just have to email me or leave a voice message about that, or go to patreon.com/ADramofOutlander to give a monthly offering to help support the running of the show. And as always, I appreciate you, and I want your feedback and suggestions and comments. And I thank you so much for listening. And until next time, Slán Java.